I would like to introduce to you Bob Lytle, and Bob Lytle is the president of a company locally called Related to Analytics, and Bob is going to introduce the panel that he's moderating.
Thank you, and we have mics. Good, thanks. And I know everybody's coming back in from lunch, and we're a little bit tight on time, so we're going to try to get this thing knocked out in just under an hour. I run an open data company that exists in Canada because we were invited here from the States, so thank you, some of you in the room. And second, exists because you're opening data. And I've got a whole story around being a small business, doing open data, and how we go and monetize that. And there's a panel tomorrow, so I'll be talking about that. Today, we want to talk to folks on the big business side. As the CIO of TransUnion up here, I got a chance to see what it was like to work with data at a very high level and a very large scale. We didn't call it open data. On the stage here today, we've got a series of folks that are definitely tapping into the things that you're opening, and we want to keep this fresh, and the questions will be a little bit lighter here because I want to turn it over to you in the crowd for some questions, because I've already heard from several of you that, well, they're very interested. What are they doing with this, or what are they doing with my stuff? So we're going to leave plenty of time for those. So to my left here is Can Zhu, Director of Data and Analytics from Teranet. Teranet leads in Canada's delivery of statutory registry services, operating the electronic land registration system for the province of Ontario and the property registry for the province of Manitoba. Next to Can is Jen Beckage. Jen is a U.S. attorney based in Buffalo, licensed here in Canada, but not allowed to be called an expert.
Licensed in the United States.
Licensed in the United States. She's going to tell us what this is. She can't give any legal advice.
I'll do my attorney disclaimer at some point.
But Jen's practice is focused on cybersecurity, data privacy, and data breach protection. And I thought that would be a very, very valuable voice to have as we talk about and wrestle with the impact of opening data and any concerns around that. Next to Jen is Bala Gopalakrishnan, who is recently minted as the Chief Data Officer of Palmorix, which is the parent company of the Weather Network, which is on all of your mobile phones. Probably, hopefully, right? And Bala runs a team of data scientists processing weather data sets and leads partnerships with universities and a whole bunch of folks that are working in the public and open data space. And to Bala's left, my good friend Joe McCarthy, leader of data acquisition in Canada for Dun & Bradstreet. So Dun & Bradstreet is the only organization that is older than the country of Canada, I think, here on this. Probably, what is it, 180 years old now? Joe? And what Joe does is lead the data acquisition process for the entire Canadian operation and works with customers to help them understand how to use Dun & Bradstreet data. So with that introduction, what I asked the group to do was just kind of briefly go through at a high level how their company uses or assists others in using open data and public data more generally, so you can get a level set on what a business does in a practical sense with the things that many of you open every day. And I think I will go in reverse, put you on the spot, Joe. So do you want to tell us a bit about Dun & Bradstreet's process and what you do with this open data?
I don't know. So Dun & Bradstreet collects data from multiple sources, right? You know, things we license directly from third parties, but also open sets that are out there that are available to us in a commercially reproducible format or under a license, right? So. And that's the challenge when it comes to open data in our organization. I mean, being a commercial, call it a commercial credit bureau, we're much more than that, but a lot of our products and services are geared towards credit and compliance and that sort of thing. You know, we're strictly commercial, so we go over and above to limit the amount of personally identifiable information that we would ever compile or consume and ingest and distribute. Because we don't want, you know, frankly, we don't want to be under the umbrella of Consumer Reporting Acts, and we're not today, and that's not something that we're looking at least for the foreseeable future, to get into, right? So we limit ourselves to if it's an open data set, it's something that's strictly commercial, except for the concept of people in a business context, right? Business owners, title codes, titles, that sort of thing. But from an open data perspective, most of the use cases that we're seeing now from a data ingestion perspective is in around building the skeleton of the record. So identifying a business as it is registered or as it licensed itself in Toronto, right? We'll identify those businesses, and then through our own systems, we call it our intelligence engine. It's debatable how intelligent it can be, but it's a system whereby we take multiple data sources, and we have thousands. I mean, we have thousands of customers reporting their aging to us on a monthly basis. That dozens of public record sources, suits and judgments, bankruptcy receiver type data that we receive. We can, on a monthly basis, bring all that information together and start to add to that skeleton that we create the meat, right? So the public record data goes on there, the trade goes on there, and then we can start to score the record and create credit scores and that sort of thing. So it's a intense process. Ideally started with some types of open data that are available.
And powered by the open information being released and then combined with purchase data, so some is proprietary and some is open. As we turn to Bala, your use case is very interesting because you both gather a significant amount of information from public source, but you also do a fair amount of data generation through usage of your various tools. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so the mission of Palmerex, which is the parent company of the Weather Network, Meteo Media Brands, is to keep Canadians safe in emergency weather conditions, as well as help them plan for their day-to-day activities, because in Canada, weather impacts everything, as you know. From a data collection or data source, open data that we ingest, it starts with weather. Weather itself is a combination of information from several different sources. So there's Environment Canada, which provides models which we use. There's National Weather Service in the US. There's European models. So we get data from a lot of these sources, blend them together to create very accurate localized forecasts that Canadians use. The other part of it is we also run the emergency alerting system. So the Amber Alerts and all those alerts that you see on the phone, we work with the provinces, municipalities to get those ingested, processed, and then make it available to distributors, whether they're telcos or TV. So we deal with a lot of data from those perspectives. And then the third piece I would say is directly data from government agencies in terms of what roads are snow cleared, what's the condition on the roads. We ingest all that to create both live dashboards for users, as well as we use that in forecasting the weather. Based on what the condition on the road is today and the weather that's coming in, how is it going to be in the future? So a lot of data we ingest to create these products. In terms of the output of what we are contributing, we have very localized weather information, so we provide APIs for anyone to take this and plug it into their site or plug it into their portal or convert that into useful information. For example, all the parks use widgets from us to provide specific weather information for their own parks for that day. So that's one example. The second one is we have a lot of users. We have almost 30 million Canadians using us every month. We have about 12 or 14 million users on our websites, 7 million on our app, and 10 million who watch our TV channel. So that turns into a lot of information. When people see weather, they reach out to us, and we are a primary source where you can ground truth what's happening compared to a forecast or an observation station. And you can use this for analysis after a weather event to see what happened and is there something the government agencies or someone could take action to plan in a better way for the future. And then the third piece I would say is untapped is a very interesting data set we have, which is the mobility data. We have over 7 million users on our app. Weather is very location specific. So we have very interesting information that we see as patterns of how do people move in summer, what happens during winter, how far are people ready to drive, what happens during a storm. All these are, again, extremely useful in applications for smart city, and I think that is virtually untapped at this point.
Thanks, Bala. And some very interesting use cases that may raise some interesting questions. So aren't you lucky to have Jen right next to here as a person who does privacy law and understands how big companies are using data and maybe how to stay safe in using that data. Tell us a little bit that you can about the kinds of things that you encounter and you know, maybe not free legal advice, but otherwise for Bala later on what he can do with that mobility data. Huh?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. This is incredibly interesting. I've sort of been in this space for a long time, the technology arena. I used to own my own technology back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it was really the advent of the internet and online shopping, and people were going online, and intense regulatory scrutiny and new laws and privacy laws. And now, you know, for a while now, I've been a lawyer focusing in on, you know, data breaches and privacy law. But I am a U.S. lawyer, and I'm not here to give U.S. law. I'm really fun at cocktail parties. This is my disclaimer. We are not creating an attorney-client relationship. I am not advising under Canada's laws. But I'm here more just to, you know, I love innovation as a former entrepreneur and a current one with my law firm. You know, for me, I kind of see it on both sides. One, I love the excitement that we're going through and all of these interesting ways that we can use information going forward, and hearing the stories this morning about, you know, keeping things open and allowing information to be shared, and that's exciting. And I lived that in the late 90s and early 2000s before the big tech bubble burst. And it's very reminiscent, you know, sitting here today when we think about open data and blockchain and AI and data science and all of these things, how, you know, again, with a lot of regulatory scrutiny, new regulations, lots of moving parts, plaintiffs, lawyers. It's a lot. It's a lot to do business today. I represent companies. I want them to innovate, and I want them to succeed and be able to navigate these really tricky waters right now.
That's great. And we'll probably have some questions that will tune towards general things to make sure that it fits within the bucket, Jen. So what I think is very interesting about CAN's business is that you've got this concept of kind of an officially sanctioned, you know, provider of what is, by all rights, data gathered by the government that's not open, but there's probably some very, very good reasons for that. We won't press you to say that unless you want to. But this concept of property data and running the registry for Ontario, for Manitoba, doesn't preclude you from also exploring how open data can be mixed and mingled to make new products. And I know that really is where Terranet is headed, right?
Yeah, exactly. So can you hear me? I'm not sure I can hear myself. Well, even though Terranet runs the land registry business for Ontario and the Manitoba government, we do have a commercial business unit that actually operates a national-based land registry database. So our data, not just, you know, it covers the entire country. So there are a lot of cases where we gather information from the open data sources where we don't have the commercial licenses. So, you know, the goal of our business unit really is to help the business community to make a decision. So our focus is more on the B2B model. And, you know, for a private business like Terranet, I mean, we face the same kind of constraints like privacy and other things as the government. So there's always constraints as to what we can do. And secondly is, you know, we're using a different model than the open data, but that does not mean that we're not open. So, I mean, there's other ways for us to share the data. It's just different model.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So I think one of the things that, and I'll speak as a business owner in the data space, we have to build systems to work with the information that you are releasing. And there's a deep and rich story about data quality and so on. I thought it would be very helpful to hear from some of the practitioners and people who are consuming at mass volume these data streams that you are opening up for us to build products and to serve the community. How big of an issue is data quality to your business and your ability to conduct data processing in an efficient way? Maybe starting with Bala.
Obviously, it's a big issue because we are massively public facing. So if we put out information based on, without vetting the data quality of something that's garbage, then that's going to affect both our brand and also the usage of the products. The very simple example I would tell you is there was an emergency alert test conducted, I think several months ago, and there were issues with regarding to some people receiving alerts and some not. That was more a telco issue. But there was another issue which I think people didn't even know behind the scenes, was someone who entered the alert from the system side made a typo in the French character. And that broke through a lot of systems, right? Because it was all completely automated and it broke a lot of systems. So data quality, if not properly vetted, can have a serious impact. The way we are dealing with it is being closely connected to the community we source it from, to make sure we have experts there that are overseeing it. We have proper relationships with them so that we have a ground truth vetting person there. We staff up internal resources as well in those specific areas. Classic example is we use OpenStreetMaps for a lot of our forecasts. If we provide weather forecast specific for a park or weather forecast specific for a road segment or highway that you're taking, we are using OpenStreetMaps as the source for that particular area. And often that could be wrong, right? So it's a big automated system which is producing this forecast, and you could place the park exactly on the opposite side of where it is, right? So in those cases, there is manual quality control where we have a final checkpoint that goes through a human to make sure that it's aligned. And then the second part of it is the users themselves. So users are pretty good in pointing out these. So we have a community of over 1 million users who provide expertise and time for us from various communities, often saying, that was wrong. I live here, what you said is completely wrong, so that we use them as evangelists, both to correct our system as well as correct the provider system as well. So I would say it's a combination of deep communication with the communities from where we are sourcing, having manual quality control on our side, and then using the users as the final veto point.
That's excellent. And so you can see the impact that it has if it's wrong, both in understanding the community, but also in emergency response. Ken, I'm wondering in your particular business, because you have companies who are depending on your title registry, your land registry to make binding legal decisions. What are some of the struggles you have? And maybe you've got two different buckets, because one, you're getting an official data stream from the province, but then there are several provinces where you're gathering it yourself. Talk a little bit about the impact of data quality on your business.
Yeah, I think the data quality is really critical for us because, we're building products that our customer use to make, critical business decisions. I mean, there are two kind of products you deliver. One is, kind of aggregated data. And that's easier because, if you have enough data elements in there and enough volume, I think it will mask some of the data quality issues. But when you're dealing with individual data piece that can, help the business to make a decision, you want to make sure the data is actually correct. So typically, from our data source point of view, we prefer use commercial data. The reason, some of the, outside of the province that we operate, there are also, commercial programs. The preference for the commercial licensing is because you can have some assurance about the quality. You got some support behind it, so you can ask questions about how data was gathered, what is there any issues, and you get the timeliness of the delivery, so you can have a reasonable assurance that data is going to come at this particular day, so you can release the product. But over time, I've seen significant improvements in the open data sector as well. There are reputable agencies like StatsCan. If they release the data, we know they have gone through a very rigorous process, then we can use their data. And the other way we use the data is use the open data to fill in some of the holes that are in our database. But we do have to go through quality checking. Typically, we'll find another source, right, to cross-validating the data, and also understand how data was collected, curated before it's delivered, so that we can make the right packaging of our data to our customers, right? And we also make it transparent to the customer. Look, here's how we get the data, here's the parameters you can make a decision on, and so that they can make informed choices. Yeah.
It's fascinating, and it reminds me, and I promise I will talk very little on what we do. We'll talk about that tomorrow. We used to depend on, I won't say which region, but it's a GTA region, to drop their file at a certain time every month, and we built programs and systems around that, and then found for one given month that the file didn't come and we were delivering some incorrect information, or at least not up-to-date information. What was heartening for me, and I will say this knowing many of you in the crowd here, because I've talked to a lot of you guys. You asked me, what do I do with your data? We actually called the region and we said, what's happening with this? Oh, thank you very much. You know, we didn't realize that. And so we found a very, very collegial community in the open data community that is releasing because it seems like they get it in what we're trying to accomplish here. I will say that it's not without detractors and not without concerns, and maybe on the privacy level, I'm taking back to the pre-lunch session, very, very fascinating kind of the different angles. And I'm wondering, Jen, if you can talk to us just a little bit about the data protection side of what companies are doing with open data, and whether it's GDPR, PIPEDA, or the Credit Reporting Act, as Joe mentioned, this concept that there's data streams coming from the government, but just because it's open doesn't mean that we're scot-free. If I get an email out of one of your data sets, and I can tell you which one of your open data company or your open data streams have emails in them, I'm still bound by CASL. Right? Just because it came from the government doesn't mean that I'm allowed to use it. Talk to us a little bit about the interesting angles that people deal with when they're dealing with all the regulations, both here and abroad.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two concepts. One is, because you talked about, collegiality, when there's innovation and new technologies and ways to use information, it's very collaborative. And whether it's we're developing PHP and we're trying to figure out what everybody else is doing, and we'll buy this guy a pizza or maybe a six-pack of beer and let's share some information. I always say no one really cares, and this probably isn't my phrase, I've probably picked it up along the way, but no one really cares until people start making money. And then, well, you bought me a pizza, but now I should probably get some interest in whatever this thing is that we developed. Similar here, I think as you start to commercialize, people start to ask more questions, especially the organization that may be responsible at the end of the day to somebody for it has to undergo maybe some scrutiny, whether it's regulations or otherwise. They're now having to expend a lot more money. So sometimes I think you get away from collaboration and community, and sometimes you have to formalize those relationships so that you know when to expect something and that it is going to be accurate, because you're passing those responsibilities down to somebody else, or you yourself as an organization are responsible to meet certain standards or comply with certain laws. It is very challenging for a company, but it doesn't mean that it should stifle innovation. It doesn't mean that it should not, that communities just shouldn't exist. I think there just has to be some ground rules, right, some standards, codes of conduct, but not to the point where it's so confusing. And I think in this global scheme that we have right now, very fragmented laws on data security, privacy, it's very difficult to operate and do business, especially when the technology is moving faster than most of the laws are.
Right, right. Joe, you've got a unique view because your company is probably among the most global in the world with the number of outposts you have and the various laws that your team has to deal with in order to ingest data. You've got some pretty kind of rigorous policies and processes that you go through, or that your lawyers and compliance people make you go through before you can onboard data. Does any of the open data that's being brought in also kind of maybe even fall afoul sometimes of your own internal policies?
Fall afoul? No,
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I talk to data governance every week on data sets, and like I said before, there's a lot of personally identifiable information that we just do not want to compile, right? So things like email you mentioned. I can tell you, if I ever brought to data governance a file that had an email address on it, that would be rejected immediately. So things like that, and terms of use are critical for us, trying to understand what data sets are available to be commercially reproduced and which ones aren't, which ones are are under the ODL license, and which maybe Creative Commons licenses don't allow for commercial reproduction. So there's that view of it, but also from an element perspective and from a data, what's on the file and what's not. There's minimum data elements we're looking for, and there's obviously data elements that we would, if it was available on there, simply because it's there, we would not consume the data. Not that we don't consume the data, remove that email, and then do something with it. We just don't touch it at all because we're, my own data governance people are in the U.S., right? They are bound by U.S. law and North American law and European law. So they try to be super sensitive and not contravene anything that would even have the, possibility of us looking like we're doing something inappropriate with the data, which causes its own bits of stress for me. Trying to case justify use cases and that sort of thing around product development. It's challenging, but it's fun.
The lawyers are the dream killers sometimes,
Yeah.
right? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am.
No comment.
We call it the sales prevention department. I think that's a different story.
No, we can help. We can help. There is a way to innovate.
So
With
So
lawyers.
I'm thinking specifically, Joe, of a few different fields, and we don't need to name what they are, but let's just say it's around segmenting neighborhoods or types of people, or just because a person is a business owner doesn't mean they're also not a human, right? And humans have certain traits and characteristics that might help us bucket things. And so I know from Dun & Bradstreet and several other in companies, we say, well, we're just not going to do that. We're not going to build lists of women-owned businesses, right? Because there's a certain sensitivity around a designated class. What we find is especially interesting, though, is that the people who knock on all of our doors to ask for that, it's the government. Yeah. And more often than any other customer set, I find in my own business, and Joe, maybe you can riff on this a bit, the concept of the public sector wanting to understand some of the very things that the public sector seems to say we shouldn't be able to understand. Sometimes it's vexing, sometimes it's the subject of jokes in the coffee room, but tell us a little bit about some of the ways that you navigate that process.
Yeah, and like you said, Bob, the requirements for this type of data, ethnicity or gender, often comes from government regulations that are put in place, and then the banks will come and look for this type of data. I mean, they would like to promote Aboriginal businesses. That's very tough for us, right? And from a data collection perspective, it's something that DNB and I know other companies have shied away from, being, kind of sensitive in many regards, ethnicity and religion, obviously, is something that we really want to stay away from. How we fix it, we're still in the process of looking at that. There's the gentleman that was up here earlier was on the Aboriginal side talking about that. There's talks going on with band leaders and Aboriginal nations themselves going on, even from a consumer reporting perspective, right? So that's ongoing. That's a tough nut to crack, though, and for lack of contravening any laws, we frankly stay away from it at this point. Right. Not to say that we wouldn't love to get to a point where we had that type of information on businesses, but right now our thinking around that hasn't fully developed yet.
Well, and I think it's going to continue to be a moving target. We talked this morning about the concept of artificial intelligence or algorithms being able to derive and define just about anything with some precision, and maybe not enough, or maybe enough precision, but certainly not using or not consuming the data doesn't mean that the data won't eventually be identified, right? And I think that's what we understand as data scientists or as people kind of in the business side of information. The information can be found. The question now is, do you have the structure and the rigor to be able to do it wisely, correctly? Bala, I'm wondering if you can share any examples you have. You're using a lot of public information, a lot of open information. Do you ever find that the open data government community itself maybe is opening things that cause you to wonder, should they have opened that? Should I be seeing this on a file? Or do you find that the files are maybe tending a little bit more towards the conservative, if you will?
I would say I'm on with Joe on this. the data that we see, if it contains personally identifiable information, we are on the same boat. We are not taking it. We also run a business in Spain, so we just went through our GDPR compliance. So we are sort of globally aware what's happening. So we look at three things: whether we ingest data or we sell data. Is there personally identifiable information? Then no. Everything that we want ingested needs to be anonymized. Second, we only deal with any type of insights, whether it's in or out. We are dealing only in the aggregate. So we are not identifying person X, Y, Z, whether it's a street address or it's an email. We're never going down to that level, but a group of people is the level that we deal with. And as you said, there's lots of demand for this data. I talked about the mobility data, for example. We are able to look at patterns of immigrants moving to Canada, for example, because they start checking weather maybe a month before, right? So we can look at this and say, what was their pattern just before moving? What was their pattern, while they landed here, and where did they end up, right? That's extremely interesting data for any use case. We are very careful in making sure that, as I said, it's anonymized, it's provided in the aggregate. And then the last part that we learned from GDPR, which is a very good thing, is that always get user consent and always get the ability for the user to opt out. So we make sure when they use our app that we don't bury our privacy policy like Apple or Google in a 30-page document that you just go down and click. It's right there. It's right there when you sign for mobility, saying this is used for analytics purposes, for other purposes. Yes, no, and they get it right away, and they have an option to opt out right away as well at any point in the app. So those are the things we have taken from GDPR. The data, I think, is incredibly valuable, when particularly user data. But going through the simple theories of don't use PII, anonymize it, use it in the aggregate, have the user consent, and have the ability for the user to opt out at any point. Those are the principles, I think, which makes it palatable for different use cases.
It's kind of interesting to hear, being here all day, how the conversation has changed, right? Or not changed, but the evolution of it. We're making all of this information available, and to hear kind of the both sides of the conversation, then to see how everyone's using it. And for me, again, I represent companies, and they're really doing, as you can hear, the best, and Bob, is you as well, right? The best that they can do to only ingest what they need for the legitimate purposes for what they're doing with their business, and really trying to take those best steps and be as responsible as they can in a very tough environment where you don't always know what you're going to get. And I didn't want that information. Don't give that to me. And then again, the complex legal framework as well.
Yeah, I think one of the issue is, I think I heard this morning about, open data, open with a purpose, right? I mean, today I think you see a lot of data being dumped on the website where individually they may not pose a threat, but if someone figure out piecing all the data together, they may be able to pinpoint a person, right? Pinpoint a person or location and so on and so forth. So I think there is a need for the government, when they operate open data, to engage with the user community to say, look, here's the data, how are you using it? And should you be using that way? And I think this is why I think, I'm proud of the way we're exposing our data, because we always engage with the end user, say, look, what data do you need? Why are you using it? What product are you creating? Who are using this data? So we make sure we're comfortable the data is protected, right? So I think that's the difference here.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and I think we're going to open in a second. So Yuri, if you want to see if we can snag some microphones. I think there's some good back and forth that we can have on here. Ken, you hit something that was very, very present, I think, for the folks in the audience to understand. We're in business because we want to grow business, not because we want to be sued out of business, right? Therefore, when a business says, I'm going to lay a claim on a piece of open data because it's going to help my business, more so than an average user of data, we're going to be careful with it. And I will tell you this, if you ever want to hear stories about how students come into our company and learn how to code, the first thing we train them how to do is how to read terms of use, how to appropriately grab data and why it's inappropriate to work with this or that sort of data. We're hypersensitive to that, not because of sales prevention, but because we don't want hassles. We want to grow our business with the things that you're opening and releasing. We can't afford to have a regulatory issue. Now, sometimes that makes companies like ours maybe too risk averse, but I think the sharp ones and the smart ones are always kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. I'm dying to hear from you guys, though. Over the last 3 years, I have heard countless people come and say, well, what exactly are you doing with it? And we'll go and show, here's the kind of stuff that we do. I'm wondering if on the floor there's anybody who has some questions for our panel. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. I am Kija Buchanan. I'm from ODI Toronto Node, the Open Data Institute for Toronto Node. And I really appreciate this discussion and the issues of compliance and privacy. However, I have a question for all of you, and this actually does involve all of you, and that is, beyond compliance, how do you give back to your source community? Because those aren't the people that are necessarily using, developing, or accessing your services, and maybe they do not have the funds to even access your services. So how exactly do you give back to your source community?
Ken, do you want to start?
Sure, I can take that. I think, as I said, having a different business model doesn't mean that data is not open. So we do actually have a process to share data with the community, but I think we need to go through that process to understand what's the purpose of the usage, right, who are using it for, and so that we can have the conversation. And in a lot of cases, we don't charge people for the data that we're giving if we understand the true purpose, and if we understand it is for research purpose, then we'll help them. In fact, if you look at the Ternet's website, we have a house price index, right, that's actually open. And that's cited by many, many different sources and used by, many communities, financial services, real estate industries, to understand the price change in Canada. So that's actually open data. We do have, more detailed data as a business program, but at least you see a combination of that as well. Okay.
How does that get back to the actual title owner of that property? Like, how does that help the actual homeowner?
Yes. So, yeah, okay.
How that helps your business user.
Right.
Your focus, and I totally understand that.
Right.
But you're not getting it from them. You're getting it from the community.
Correct.
How did
Yes, so we do deploy the data back to through professionals. For instance, we have a product called the Geo Warehouse where we expose all the land registry data to the realtors, which in turn serve their clients, right? So we organize the data, so we package them in a meaningful way that support their business, which in turn benefits consumers. Okay, that's good. Okay.
We operate in two ways. One is if it's data that we are taking and monetizing, then we do rev share often. So a good example of it is we do pollen forecast, and we use pollen data, and it's very important for some Canadians with allergies. So we source from certain labs, and what we make sure is, the monetization we see on the page is rev shared with them. And if we use it for other commercial purposes, then we make sure that they are part of the commercial terms and agreements as well. So there is that part. There is, as I said, we have lots of users. The second part of it is they produce a lot of content themselves. Lots of people submit photographs to us of active weather. They provide inputs at the ground truth level of what's happening during an active weather. What we have, that's very much more harder to beyond giving them credit to convert into a rev share model. In those cases, what we are making them is come up with their own citizen journalism and promote them. So if a person in a community is really active and is able to give lots of insights that's valuable to the community, we bring them to the forefront through our apps and sites and give them that citizen journalism voice, which often leads to them then finding their own careers and launching on their own as well.
That's good.
Joe?
From a commercial perspective, D&B is unfortunately a little unique in Canada, aside from our UK and US brothers, in that we don't have ready access to federally or business registrations en masse in Canada. Like the UK has Government's House, corporate house data. State and federal registries are available en masse in the US, but not so much in Canada. So how do we give back? I mean, the utilization of open data allows us to see businesses quicker than would have been traditionally visible to us, right? In the past, we'd be waiting for companies to extend credit to a small business before we saw them, or maybe they listed themselves in a yellow page directory. We saw them and started to track them. Now, through open data, it's becoming, it's still difficult, but it's a little bit more possible for us to see these businesses quicker. Allows us to create a DUNS number, if you've heard that, or a DNB report on these businesses. When their banks then look at DNB for this information when they're extending financing to small businesses. Without that benefit, many small business owners have to, secure a business loan through their personal finances, which becomes very taxing, right? So, I'm proud to say that DNB facilitates that through financial institutions to alleviate that kind of pressure on small business owners in Canada. And we're getting better at it as time goes on in Canada and in identifying these businesses quicker, building robust reports around the business, which enables the banks to adjudicate a loan based on the business qualities rather than the business owner themselves.
So I think it's important to draw the connection between a growing economy and benefit to the community, right? Which is, I think, what we're hearing from you, Joe, is that as credit becomes more available, that helps the community. I think it's a fair question to say, and we've had this before. I feel like, my friend, you're channeling Tracy L'Oreal. Is Dr. L'Oreal in the office? Right? She asks that question almost every time we get together from Carleton. It says, when are you you're using my stuff, what are you giving back? At least we're a small company, right? And we'd love to work with you guys and do things as we grow our business. We actually opened some of our data sets, so we're happy that some of the related to data sets are on the Niagara Open Data Portal, where you can go and download things that are related to sports stadiums or things like that. So small ways to give back. I would say it's a very, very important question to keep on asking, so that we're all part of this ecosystem together. You're excited about releasing data, we're excited about using it, monetizing it, and we're all growing together. What other questions on the floor?
Hi, my name is Matt. I'm from the city of Brampton, and so with a lot of municipal open data programs, we always struggle to understand who's using the data and what they're using it for. And knowing that would help us build our programs and release more data and influence the corporation to get on board. So I'm wondering, and I may have missed this at the beginning, but how often do you reach out to your data sources to let them know that you're using it, or to provide feedback?
Well, typically, if we're under a commercial program, we typically have some kind of approval process, right? So before we develop a product, we would always go back to the sources and say, look, here's how we're going to use your data. Is that under the term of the agreement? If yes, and then we can, start to develop the products. And sometimes they will come back and, do auditing on us, make sure we follow the terms. So there's always a feedback loop.
Yeah, that's good. Is there reaching out that goes on from Dun & Bradstreet?
Well, from an internal perspective, we do review T's and C's every year to make sure that we're still compliant. But to be honest with you, most of the open data sets we get are through third-party compilers. Bob, right? So, that's not the business that we're in. Is reaching out to 100 different websites and compiling open data, but. When we have abilities to do that directly, I'd love to give feedback. In fact, I'd love to give more frequent feedback to the owners of those open data facilities, which sometimes is very difficult to do and difficult to find, right? The data is open. The contact information of who to speak to about it is not necessarily there, right? I'd love to have that kind of open, because even with my own paid data vendors that I'm buying and licensing data from, I have that open and honest discussion around data quality, ways in which to improve it, right? Either we talked about giving back. I would love to give back to some of these open data sources around how to improve data quality, aggregate data together, dedupe these files. and not necessarily at a charge. Maybe this is a partner relationship, right? So, yeah, you know what? We need to do more of that at the open side, and I would encourage that kind of discussions between any of our organizations and these open data owners as well.
Challenge accepted, Matt. Absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing,
yeah.
sorry, just to
Go
jump
ahead.
in. I mean, the other thing we're trying to do going forward is more trying to build more data partnership, right? So we get open data from some of the municipalities in Ontario, and we're trying to go back and say, look, we get your data, we curate your data. Can we not ship our data back to you so that we both improve our data quality? So that's another thing that we're doing. Okay. That's good.
Yeah, I'll just add that, it depends on the type of data as well. We sometimes give too much feedback to municipalities that can overwhelm them, particularly in winter. We source data about, snow flows and what roads are cleared and so on. And they are updated in certain frequency because that's the resources the municipalities and provinces have. But the users see it much faster, right? So we can overwhelm you with a lot of feedback saying, that's wrong. That flow was cleared and you haven't updated your site. So there is that healthy feedback depending on the type of data. In certain cases, like if it's road data or things that's updated every 6 months, then that would follow that model of frequency in terms of feedback.
So quick show of hands for those of you who are involved in releasing data. Who else would love to hear from somebody on the stage or somebody else, right? Folks have cards and so on, so that'd be good. But I think it's a very, very important thing for you to share with us that the more you know about what we're doing, first you get rid of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt if there is that. And then the second you go, well, what can I do to grow more? I mean, I know for me in my business, I'm very, very heavily, I think in the room here is probably the first person I had my first business meeting with when I launched 3 years ago. And it was from Niagara's Open Data. And we talked about what it is that we could do to give back and what we could use from them and why don't you have this and this would be awesome. That's led to a wonderful relationship that's good for my business. I think it could be good for many others. We have a time for a few more questions. I want to make sure that we keep it open. I was expecting a couple of landmines. Not that I'm inviting them. Maybe I am.
Oh, no, I'm not a landmine. Oh, sorry. I probably don't even need a microphone. The flip side of the coin is what we need from you is we really have been challenged to put together use case stories of how open data is being used. And out on the front lines with the people you deal with is really where the rubber hits the road for us. So how do we get these from you? How's the best way to connect with you so that we can start gathering these Canadian examples? Because there's lots of American and international ones, but we have a number in Ontario, but for the rest of the provinces, there's not a whole bunch.
So if somebody wanted to get in touch with your business, Bala, and talk about, hey, tell me a little bit more about that. Do you have a card? I mean, what's the
Just call
what's
us.
the mechanism that you'd love them to use?
Give everyone your cell phone number right now.
No, we do have a partnerships division at Weather Network that's fairly active. So as I said, lots of communities and websites like parks, schools, all connect to us today, primarily from a weather perspective to get their localized weather or have a widget there. I think that probably is a given by now. I think where it can go and we can reach out to these same partnership people is there's lots more use cases for data. You can look at historical weather data for that region and make decisions around it. As I said, you can look at use cases for user-related data in a privacy-safe way. Those are the areas I think where we need to move on. But we do have a big partnership division which deals with all of this.
Well, and I'll just add, I think it's more than just what are you doing with this particular data set, but that ripple effect, job creation, education, making students in school now open, right, in their minds about new technologies that they might want to develop and how they can collaborate with government to do that. So I think it's a bigger ripple effect than maybe just how are you using it to create this one app or provide this one resource.
Am I correct in saying that one of the real needs you have is you know, let's be honest about it, dollars and cents. Somebody's asking, why should I invest more staff, more time, more machines in this open data thing? Prove to me that this thing is worth it. And having those stories is one more angle that you can give. Would that be a fair understanding?
Definitely. The
Yeah.
value add of open data is sort of in its sort of inception stage in Canada. Like, we really do need stories from across the country on this. So yes, definitely. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting topic because when I look at one of the presentation this morning talking about Canada being #1 in terms of the open data, like we're measuring ourselves in terms of the volume of the data we release, but nobody says what is the value you create from the open data you release. Maybe that's what I think we're probably measuring the wrong thing. Okay.
So if I can encourage those who are going to be here tomorrow, the panel that is on businesses that are growing because, very specifically, open data would be another angle, too, to be able to ask that question. Nathan, do we have anybody else? There we go.
I'm going to push it even further. I'll say, don't take this for granted. This morning, there's panelists that talked about, politicization. I don't know how to say this, but the open data programs are not yet enshrined and safe. There's some provinces that don't even officially have open data programs. And frankly, we don't see the business community talking about that, talking about the fact that they need open data. Also, what are their needs? If you're going to bank the house on a data set, presumably you want this data set not to change and not to have Larry over there decide that column D is irrelevant, right? So I think we need to hear your voices more. And I think also as we get closer to our summit next year, where a lot of things will gel, a lot of issues that have been separate so far will start gelling. So businesses have so far been on their side, very different from the other side of open government that goes into trust and trust in institutions and rights. We heard it this morning, digital data rights, a democracy. And so I think, maybe you want to think as part of your corporate social responsibility, the way companies started to issue, their green efforts, I think companies will want to will talk about what they do with the data and how they are ethically using and contributing to the data. So I'd love to hear you on that.
Let's go on.
Yeah, so the one example I can give, it's not out in the public, is we work with Sick Kids Hospital, for example, and there is a very specific illness that's very, very sensitive to weather. So they are doing a research through the Vector Institute right now to take about 15 years of historical weather data, correlate it with the patients and their illness and their conditions on specific days, and find patterns, and thereby, either prevent or find better ways to treat this illness. So there's things like that happening, but I think what you're saying is a lot of it is piecemeal. It's not out in the open. It's probably aware between these organizations and a small number of folks. Canada is, as you know, is always behind US in beating their own drum. So we all have to go out and beat a lot of these use cases out, I think.
Joe.
Yeah, I would say, and I agree with exactly what you're saying. Our voice out there it needs to be more prevalent. I think that, and I've thought in the past of actually creating or championing a consortium of like businesses like ourselves. I mean, you can pull, TU, Equifax, Terranet, DMB, getting together with one voice around what, as organizations, what we would like to see and what would benefit the community and the finance community and small businesses and import, export, what we could possibly develop out to help those initiatives. That thinking probably hasn't happened en masse yet, and I would love to see us get to a point. Bob, maybe you could be the moderator or something like that because you're excellent, right? Is bring some of these organizations together with one message to go. And then, the challenge is for me to go to the federal government or go to Ontario. I'm one guy working for one organization that, I have my own spin on things, and I might not necessarily know what a consumer credit bureau wants, although I did work for one once. But to come together with a baseline of asks around open data and maybe formalize it in some way, I think that would go a long way.
Sounds like there's a two-way asks that would probably be very valid. I smell a working group here. So, Mary, what's the path that we could follow to follow up maybe and gather interest for that?
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think it would be an outcome from our conference.
Oh, I know how much you love outcomes.
Well,
Absolutely.
something we can say, because the conversation at the end of the day tomorrow, to wrap up, is where are we going next? And what makes sense? How can we focus our efforts and weave them together? So this sounds like a great.
And even at the Open Government Partnership has been trying to have private companies come as stakeholders. We have academia, we have civil society, we have governments. So let's try this. Let's start something in Canada and show how each player in the community has a role to play. So both responsibilities and things that we want to ask, and let's have this discussion. Yeah.
So after this session, we'll have a water glass here. You drop your business card in, you get a free pizza maybe, or lunch. And that's at least a nice commitment to follow up with. I can't leave this topic without mentioning our friend Kevin Tour, who's going to be here tomorrow. The Open Data Exchange is one incredibly strong, important voice in bringing business and open data together. You'll hear from Kevin tomorrow. That might be the right home for this kind of thing from a business perspective. And if you haven't seen these guys, it's called ODX, and you check them out. It's partially funded publicly, but they do some great work. We have time for one more question, I think, and then we're almost back on schedule, kind of, if there is. Okay. So, parting shot, parting voice, if you had one request to make, we get the microphone right now. If you had one request to make of our public sector champions, friends, combatants, or otherwise, what might you make from an open data perspective, and what would you love to see the Canadian public sector do for open data?
Yeah, so I think I should go back to the open with a purpose. I think the conversation between two parties, I think, is critical. So we understand what data should be released and how they should be used, and I think that's the future.
Perfect. Jen?
Yeah, for me, and again, thanks for having me be part of this. It's the dialogue, the conversation to watch what just happened is incredible for people to get together. The story I always tell, when we had our tech company, I remember a bunch of physicians came in with Palm Pilots, and there's a group of them, and they said, wouldn't it be so great if we could exchange medical records and patients' medical files on these devices, and we could learn more. And we were like, yes, that's incredible, but the infrastructure wasn't there. Who's going to hold it? How do you hold it? What format? What are the rules? What are the privacy rules? It just wasn't there yet. So both sides, all sides have a lot of questions right now. It's going to take a little bit of time, but this is the exciting part. This is the part that you want to be part of, the innovation, but having the dialogue's great, and it's been wonderful to watch it unfold today.
Thanks, Jen. Paula?
I would say having a good framework of what problems so there's a very good framework today of what problems data solves in a B2B environment. Businesses are beginning to be aware, and this industry is being formed. I think it's not very clear beyond a very high level vision of we can build smart cities, we can make better transport of what open data can solve in the government space, starting with that and then defining, okay, to solve that, what are the key pieces required, would then make this conversation, I think, much, much better and much more richer.
Thanks, Paula.
And I would say the continuing discussions and the feedback, I think I heard feedback directly from Brampton over there, but also from the federal side. I'd love to have more of that openness and communication going back and forth, not only around requirements, but also around blue sky thinking, even if the answer ultimately is no. Would love to get the opportunities to discuss with the stakeholders here what opportunities and what the future could look like around open data if private companies were involved.
So, and I'm so proud of all of my big company sisters and brethren for keeping it at a very wonderful level. I'm going to go base level and say open up more contracts data And if you're opening it up down to 25K, drop it to 15 or drop it to 10 or $2 or whatever. We love contracts data because it helps us build business and project the market.